I'm going to start by asking both of you to introduce yourselves, and let's get going. Who's first?
Shereen.
Shereen, you're first.
My name is Shereen Essof, and I am currently serving as the Executive Director of JASS Associates, which is a feminist movement building support organization that is really dedicated to strengthening the voice, visibility, and collective organizing of power of women to create a just and sustainable world. And we work in 3 different regions, so Southeast Asia, Southern Africa, and Central America, as well as do some light solidarity work in the US. I grew up in Zimbabwe and have worked and played extensively in the Southern African region and on the African continent. So Africa as a continent is very, very close to my heart. And kind of flows in my veins. Prior to joining JASS, I was based at the University of Cape Town at the Africa Gender Institute, where I was teaching and researching and organizing. I'm an organizer at heart, and my organizing at that point was really with cleaning workers and women in informal settlements around accessing basic needs. And prior to that, I was in Zimbabwe doing similar kinds of work. So that's really where my roots are, and I guess my political trajectory in some sense. Over to you, Joanne.
Thank you. And I'm Joanne Sandler. I have the great privilege and pleasure of working with Shereen, and I am the co-chair of the board of JASS, where Shereen is the executive director. I've been working on feminist organizing and women's rights transnationally for about 40 years. And some part of that was at the United Nations, at the UN Development Fund for Women. I was the deputy executive director, and I've worked with lots of women's rights movements, governmental organizations, and on many issues. I left the UN in 2011 and started working with a group called the UN Girls Education Initiative, and which works to support gender equality in education around the world. And it occurred to me later in life, right, that as feminist movements and a lot of the feminist organizing we've been doing, and I don't know if Shereen agrees with this, but I feel like we have neglected education a lot, right? We have focused so much on ending violence against women and women's economic security and economic justice and political participation and leadership. And, you know, it really has opened my eyes over the past 9 years, immersing myself more in the issue of education and what has happened to both girls and boys and others in schools since the world made a global commitment beginning in 2000 to equity and parity in education, which was not a profound enough commitment. But so I have learned a lot about education over the past 9 years.
So when you think about the film that people have enjoyed, and I'm sure that you saw it with slightly different eyes, knowing as much as you do about Africa. And I was wondering if perhaps you could share some of those perceptions.
Oh, gosh, I mean, where does one start, right? I think that the film was so multi-layered, and there were so many sets of issues that it was actually, for me, certainly putting on the table as windows, right, into thinking about the meaning of both education, but also this thing that we call development, right? And how it is that impacts, or how it is that gets held in terms of both the imaginations, but also the day-to-day lives of people. And so perhaps there's maybe three or four things that I'll just sort of surface that kind of struck me. I mean, the first one is really, I'll build off where you left, Joanne. how it is that we think about education. You know, I think that part of the colonial package on the African continent was education. So, you know, in many parts of Africa, mission schools were very, very central in both feeding and developing, you know, the skills and mindsets of liberation leaders. And so education has always played a really, really central role on the African continent. And education, both in terms of a stepping stone to better and different, but also education in the sense of, what do we know as a people? And I think there's something in the film that very, very interestingly and subtly for me surfaces that. So how do we reclaim Indigenous ways of knowing as part of an understanding of how we know and what constitutes knowledge? And so, you know, the emblematic dances, you know, that sort of come in, the Nyao dances that kind of come in, they weave in and out of the film. For me, you know, it was a signifier of that. I think the second thing that I'd say about education is the disparities that exist in contexts where poverty and inequity is very, very real. So the choices that people are constantly making about survival, about where money goes or where resources go. And resources is not just money, it's also time, right? So do you spend the resources in plowing the land because that's going to get you food, right? Or do you spend the resources sending your son and or daughter, and then there's gendered choices there, right, to school to get an education. So I think there's a thick layer of you know, things that one is invited to think about around the meaning of education and the importance of education, and what constitutes education, I guess. I think the second thing that I would like to lift up, which is not necessarily really upfront and present in the movie for me, but I think how it is that development and extractivism and climate change intersect is something that's very real in the film. And the impacts of that on the day-to-day lives of ordinary people in countries that are resource rich, but are at the cutting edge of an extractivist agenda, is something that is ratcheting up and is something that we are actually living with in very, very real ways now. In northern Malawi, mining rights is a big thing and communities are being displaced from their lands because mining companies are getting mining claims and rights to be able to mine. So for me, that was the sort of second thing that was very, very, very present. I think the third thing is really about the land and the centrality of land as the foundation of struggles for liberation, and the meaning of land in the lives and imaginations of people as to who we are and where we belong, for me was another thing that was worth thinking about and being reminded of. And I think linked to that is the meaning of self-determination. And for me, the movie really, really captured that, the determination to overcome, to innovate, right, to survive, I think is absolutely critical. It's linked to the land in the movie, but it's also in really interesting ways about how we think about community. And I think for me, those things are the things of movement building, right? It's the things that when you talk about, you know, investing in women's rights movements, Joanne, as part of your work over 40 years, it's that, right? It's that the building of collective power for change is about the imagination. It is about building community and collectives. It is about self-determination and agency. And it is about hopes and dreams. And I think the movie encapsulates that in a really, really powerful way. And I think, yeah, for me, that was the third thing. And the last thing that I want to say is, you know, I think in the global imagination, Africa as a continent or Malawi as a country is always viewed through the lenses of poverty and or destruction, right? So you will hear about Malawi or another country in Africa if there's a war or if there's a famine or if there's a drought or. And I think, as you said, Wendy, Africa is not a country, right? It is made up of a number of different countries in different regions that have their own cultures, their own traditions, their own cuisines, right? Their own ways of being, of dancing, of dressing, of music. And I, right? And I think that there's something about centralizing another narrative about what it is that Africa is, what it is that countries in Africa and people in Africa have to offer. That is not just about the death and destruction and the poverty and the illness. That I think is really, really powerful. And The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind, I think, goes some way in redressing that narrative.
Thank you. Beautiful. Joanne?
No, yes, I completely agree with Shereen. It's interesting what Shereen picked up, because I also was really taken with the collective and the community piece, and how important collectivity and community is, and how loving, you know, when the chief gets beaten up, for instance, what that did to people's souls and how people came around. At the same time, what fascinated me in the movie was the story that wasn't told, was the story behind the story. So what grabbed my attention was the very last kind of, subtitling or whatever at the end, where it said that William's sister didn't go to school. And I thought, okay, that's the second movie, because William's sister, you got the feeling, or I got the feeling, was this brilliant young woman who embodied all of the inequities and the struggles and the challenges that young women embody in, as Shereen said, in a community where there are such difficult decisions to be made about where you spend your limited resources and what you consider a long-term investment and a short-term investment. And William's mom as well. You know, I also thought the scene where the dad goes away to participate in a political protest, and men come to the house and steal the grain and threaten William's mom and sister. And his sister later says, you know, but dad went away, our father went away and left us, we could have been raped. And just thinking about the pressures on everybody, the men, the women, the community, because of those resource constraints, and how the story of William and his community and his family was an uplifting story, and it had so much beauty in it. And that, as Shereen said, is such an important story to tell. And it's a story of dignity, right? And it's a story of aspiration and generations. And that when you tell the story, when you tell the uplifting and inspiring story about a person and a family and a group that are able to overcome those challenges, that you also have to recognize the underlying systemic challenges and also opportunities, but the challenges that create a situation where a brilliant young man and a brilliant young woman, his sister, right, have their lives are dependent on so many factors, including the climate. So it was really, at the end, that was my takeaway, that, you know, this was one story, it was an important story, and how many other stories are wrapped up in that story.
One of the things that I noticed is that William's talent becomes something where they take him away from the village. He then goes to school, he comes to the US, he goes to Dartmouth, and he is still in the States. I'm very concerned about Africa as a future where talent is often extracted from the local, and wanted to know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, just to bounce off Joanne's last point, and then I will comment on what it is that you've put on the table, Wendy. You know, I think it's Chimamanda Adichie who talks about the danger of the single story, right? And, you know, I think that certainly from a movement building perspective and from the work that JASS has invested in Malawi over a period of almost 12 years, the meaning of education and the meaning of women's agency through an investment in strengthening women's leadership, in creating safe spaces for women to come together and to learn and to share and to use the lived experience as a means of developing an analysis that is rooted in a reading of power, including the meaning of husbands, the meaning of traditional leaders, the meaning of religious leaders, and the kinds of power that they wield in determining the lives and the choices that women have, I think is really, really critical to put on the table. I think it's also important to put on the table that it's really, and we all know this, you know, the reproductive labor of women, survival of communities happens on the back of the reproductive labor of women, right? And that was true way back when, and it is still true now, right? And so how it is then that women are able to leverage their collective power and engage to ensure that the young woman does go to school, that the young woman is not raped, is really, really critically important. And there's amazing movement work in Malawi, you know, through a campaign called the Our Bodies, Our Lives campaign, certainly that JASS is part of, where we've seen amazing engagements around a whole set of things from health to education to violence. So I wanted to just lift that up as we think about a more multi-dimensional telling of the tale. I think in terms of brain drain, you know, it's very real. It's very, very real as a phenomenon. And it's about, you know, globalization and how it is that a globalized world, you know, both allows for the uptake, right, of those bright stars or sparks, as well as aspirations, right? Who sets the aspiration as to what it is that success looks like, right? And I think, although global north and global south are very one-dimensional terms that I think are quite problematic right now, you know, the aspiration to, you know, the access of resources or lifestyles or things, commodities in the West, right, is still very, very real. However, you know, I think that there is a growing and quite consolidated, actually, political move around the meaning of Africans in the diaspora who are doing the work as part of the meaning of transnational solidarity and this globalized world, right? To put those issues on the table wherever it is that they are, right? In terms of the meaning of the shifting of the center of gravity in terms of how it is that we understand the continent. And so, and that's dynamic and it's vibrant and it exists in multiple different places. And there are people who are committed to a Pan-Africanist internationalist solidarity agenda that I think is really, really important. So it cuts two ways, right? It cuts two ways, I think. It's a complex thing, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Joanne, do you want to end with any other thoughts? And then we will leave this conversation until March 24th, when Shereen and Joanne have both agreed to come back for a live question and answer session. I can't imagine how many questions you will be swamped with, but I look forward to that. Joanne, thoughts?
Well, only to say that, you know, Malawi, I was in Malawi more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
And it is so stunningly beautiful, so stunningly beautiful. And politics, you know, analysis, gender power relations aside, it was just a total pleasure to watch the beauty of that film and the beauty of the landscape. And, you know, when you talk about extractivism, which there's the extraction of resources, which, you know, have been taken from Africa, there's the extraction of people, although I think what Shereen said is so true, that now there is the possibility of a kind of transnationalism that there wasn't 20 years ago. And so hopefully, you know, there will be more justice. But I just hope more people, when we can, and with respect for the environment, have the opportunity to see the beauty of Malawi and Southern Africa, because it is just so stunningly beautiful. And I have to say, Wendy, very grateful to you, because we got to watch that film and live in that space for that time, which was just a pure delight.